Start that. I'm McKenna Martinez, a freshman at the University of Oregon, and today I have Professor Stacy Alimo with me to ask her questions regarding ocean extinction and her article, Wanting All the Species to Be, Extinction, Environmental Visions, and Intimate Aesthetics. Professor Alimo, thank you for meeting with me today. Before I get started, would you mind just giving a brief overview of what your article is about for those that haven't had a chance to read it?
Oh, that's hard. Very complicated. So it's an academic article and it's condensing a lot of conversations and theoretical debates about environmentalism and the way in which environmentalism has been interconnected with colonialism, extractivism, and other things. And so when we write academic articles, we're drawing on a huge amount of material and trying to condense it all in a way that we can make arguments that are kind of multifaceted. So it's pretty complicated. So it's getting to yeah. And I'm kind of amazed that somebody who is a freshman would even be reading this essay, because of course you probably noticed it wasn't really intended for that audience. So
Right.
yeah, so I'm impressed that you're doing this, just because it's usually people would have to spend many years reading in these fields before things would make sense. But basically the question that I start with is this question that was posed to me by Estrida Nemanis and Jennifer Ray Hamilton during a conference in Australia several years back, in which they wanted everybody who was in environmental studies and in feminist environmental studies, or the post-humanities, to to answer the question, what do you want? Which I thought was a really funny question. We're not usually asked that in academics,
Right.
like, what do you want? And so I thought, what do I want? And I thought, my number one desire is to want all the species on the planet to continue to be, because I am very concerned with species extinction. I'm really concerned about that. And I'm worried that the focus on climate change, while climate change is, of course, very important, some of that focus has been propelled by anthropocentrism, meaning humans want everything to stay how we want it as humans. Like, we don't want big storms, we don't want drought, we don't want these things because they hurt us. But I think environmentalism at its root really does need to also be concerned with other species. And we're in the midst of the 6th great extinction. So that's my starting point, is to say I want all of these species to continue to be, because I am very concerned about species extinction and what kind of world is going to be left when these species disappear. And just for their own sake, I think they're intrinsically valuable for themselves, not for humans. So that's my starting point. But then that gets complicated because of the histories of colonialism, extractivism, and capitalism, all pose this concept of the globe, like thinking about the globe and who gets to say what they want for the whole planet is really problematic, because especially in terms of, say, settler colonialism, why do I get to just say I want all of these species to be? Like, what vision of the planet is that? And how do I, as a person, because I'm white, because I'm middle class, because I'm a settler colonialist that has all of this privilege that enables me to even think in that kind of global way? And so then that becomes its own problematic. And so I try to figure out, what to do about that, because I still want all the species to be. Don't get me wrong, I still want that, but I also want to think about how that gets complicated because of the histories of racism, colonialism, genocide, and how that's interrelated with Western environmentalism.
Great,
So
thank you. That was a great introduction to it.
Thank you.
So getting into the first question, in your article, you mentioned you would like to consider the possibilities for marine species to circulate in aesthetic modes that don't compound the meanings of disembodiment. Could you kind of explain what you mean by aesthetic modes?
Yeah, just I should have had one of my books here to show you. So right now I'm writing a book about deep sea creatures, and I'm looking at how they circulate, the images of deep sea creatures circulate through science and the arts and popular culture. And one of the things I've been really interested in is not only how the sea creatures are themselves, the deep sea creatures, really beautiful. I mean, most of us would think that they're really quite stunning and beautiful with their bioluminescence, and they're so weird and interesting and all of that. But not but that the census of marine life put a lot of effort into creating, even though they're doing this huge scientific project, this global enormous scientific project, mapping and counting every creature in the ocean, which of course is impossible, which I'm also interested in the impossibility of that. But the aesthetic is just basically, I'm using it in a really basic term just to mean how beauty is circulating, and then what that means for how we connect to the creatures.
Okay, thank you. It's very interesting. I never heard of aesthetic mode be used before, so that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So it's really kind of a basic thing in the way I'm starting with it, which is they're very beautiful. They circulate with the census of marine life. They circulate as these highly stylized, gorgeous photos, like coffee table books with just breathtakingly gorgeous photographs in them. And then what does that do? And so the issue is, in capitalism, of course, everything on the planet can be commodified, could be made into just an object so that you consume. So then it's, if you have a coffee table book that has images of deep sea creatures in it, is it like you own them? Are they just objects that you own and you just get to say, oh, look, this is so beautiful, just like a painting would be beautiful, and you're happy you own that as an object, and then there's no environmental connection there at all? Or is there a sense of intimacy, connection with the creature somehow, even if it's sort of imagined, sorry, if it's speculative or if it's imagined, is there some kind of aesthetic connection happening that then is really the only way that people would be concerned about deep sea creatures? Because they're not creatures, you can't go out like you'd go out bird watching or something. You can't just go see deep sea creatures unless you pay, of course, millionaires can pay lots and lots of money to go anywhere on the planet, even the bottom of the ocean, but most of us can't do that. So what do we have? We have images, and that's basically it. So how do they function? And then how do they function between, say, popular culture, environmentalism, and then the science that they came from?
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Moving on, being an ecofeminist, why do you think feminism and environmentalism contribute to one another, and how do you think that contributes to ocean extinction specifically?
Okay, so my position is really complicated regarding ecofeminism. So I don't call myself an ecofeminist. And the reason why is because I think that whether or not feminism and environmentalism work together depends on exactly the kind of feminism and exactly the kind of environmentalism. So here's a couple examples. So there's a whole trope in Western culture of women being closer to nature, right? Okay, that has almost always been used against women. So the idea that women should be barefoot and pregnant, that they should not have birth control, that they're like magically close to nature because they can be mothers. All of that has been very bad for women and for feminism, and especially for queer people, for trans people. All sorts of people have been hurt by this idea that nature holds gender essentialisms, or the idea of like, what is a man, what is a woman? That's a really harmful idea. So I try to stay very far from that. And then in terms of environmentalism, the idea that women are, as Val Plum would put it, the so-called angels in the ecosystem is also really problematic, because there's nothing about being female that makes you less harmful to the planet, because most of the harms have to do with economics, class, especially, right? So poor people and people who live in poor countries do so much less harm to the planet than rich people do. So that has more to do with economics and class. So when we talk about the relationship between environmentalism and feminism, it becomes really complicated, because it's more about how it's more about critiquing how systems of knowledge, and especially in Western culture, these binaries where the nature culture binary lines up with a bunch of other binaries. So if you think nature, whoops, let's go back. Let's put culture on the top. So it's a hierarchy. Culture and versus nature. So they have the high and the low, and then you have human versus animal, the high, the low. But what happens in Western culture is those also get mapped onto people. So then women, men are the high category, women are the low category associated with a denigrated nature. But that also maps with concepts of racism and concepts of anti-indigenous colonialism and other things. So
Okay.
So it's a really complicated landscape, and I think critiquing those things, and then in a more affirmative feminism would try to find other modes of knowing and being that are anti-sexist and are more positive toward non-human animals, non-human species, and the environment. But it's really complicated, because people will often think, oh, women are just like better environmentalists. Wait, what? How? It doesn't
Right.
make any sense.
Okay. That
Okay.
was great description, because I was wondering about that while reading through the article. So this question's gonna go a little bit back to when you were talking about the coffee table books and are they just objects? When it comes to marine life, do you think it's possible to completely disconnect environmental visions from the history of colonial violence and objectification, or do you feel too much has already been done?
Yeah, I think, I think this is the hardest thing, is that even the concept of species or taxonomy, the way in which we categorize everything in nature, even that is bound up with a kind of that same set of dualisms where human is the knower, and then everything in nature becomes the known or objectified. It's like there's all, if you imagine the bottom of the sea, there's all of this life, and it's all doing its own thing all over the place. And then the call to identify or count the species is an imposition to say, okay, there's it's chopping everything, it's making these categories. And that is a sort of epistemological mode of control or mastery, like a mode of knowing that's about control and mastery. Okay. But within what we're in right now, which is the 6th great extinction and the Anthropocene, when humans have had such an enormous effect on the planet and we're losing all these species, you can't really have environmentalism, I don't think, without keeping track of species, even if that's really complicated, and even if there's all of these issues with it. I think we still need to be, we need to know how different deep sea creatures, for example, are being affected by ocean acidification, warming waters, industrial fishing, mining, all of those things. And how do you say there's been these negative effects if you don't have information about species and what's happening with them? So it's really hard to imagine like exactly a way around that, especially for the deep seas, because they're so inaccessible that they need, the money of big science. It's not something like, it's not like for traditional ecological knowledges and tribal knowledges. That is such a different scenario where people have lived in the places, they have a whole way of being, and everything that they're doing, like everything is interconnected. But the bottom of the ocean, all of us, pretty much, if we're part of a capitalist economy, are destroying the habitats of the deep sea, and yet we don't have any connection to it.
Okay,
So, yeah.
okay, thank you. Um, why do you think expressing more intimate ways of knowing would be more responsive than transcendent ways, and how do you view those as different?
Okay, yeah, so there are all these, I wrote about this in another book. There are all of these ideas of what the Anthropocene is. And most of it, what it does is it visualizes the Earth as the planet from far up, like way out, like as if you were in a spaceship and you're looking back at Earth. That to me is really problematic because it gets back to this idea that somehow humans are exceptional and above, literally in this case, above and beyond it all. Like it's all about like what we're thinking. Like we think this, we imagine this, and we're like way up here, and then the Earth is here. But actually, we are on this planet. So everything we do to the planet, we're part of that. And so my second book, I came up with this term called transcorporeality, which is about how our bodies are materially part of the material interchanges in a kind of post-natural world, because we've created all of these chemicals and radioactive substances and other things that we can't see them. We don't know if they're there, but they're always kind of circulating through us. So we're very much part of this world. And I think anything that makes us think that we are somehow off in our little spaceship somewhere else is a form of denial of the need to actually take care of this planet. So that's very important to me. And so the intimacy that I'm drawing on different traditions of feminist environmentalism, but also indigenous environmentalisms and other things where there is much more of a sort of sensual and direct sense of a connection and being with, rather than controlling things that are outside of you. So it's how do we shift from ideas of ownership and control of this world that is supposedly like, oh, there's a world out there, and then we as humans get to control it and master it, versus a relationality, which a lot of the feminist science studies writers have talked about relationality, and relationality is really important in indigenous studies. So thinking about relationship in terms of an ethical mode of being, and an ethical mode of being in terms of being an environmentalist, that's what I am trying to shift toward.
Okay. And leading into our last question for the day, how do you think your standpoint with feminism and environmentalism can help articulate the idea of using intimacy and mediation rather than practices of gluttonous consumerism to your audience?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I mean, we're all in Marxist theory, there's a word interpolation, which means that you're kind of sucked into the whole capitalist ideology. And so you're just sort of, we're all part of this capitalist ideology. And I think that one of the issues with capitalism is that it gives us these commodified objects, and we're supposed to get all of our pleasure from these things that we buy. So it's like you're always buying pleasure, you're always buying a dopamine hit, you're always like, and I think that the kind of shifting from an environmental standpoint, the shifting toward pleasure and desire and the aesthetic and care and love and concern is, we almost have to shift out of that mode of capitalist consumption in order to sort of be present. Say, I mean, for me in my own life, my best example would not be the deep sea creatures, but would be my gardens, because I've created these habitat gardens, which are about 90% native plants. And the gardens are mainly for the birds, the butterflies, the bees, other insects. So I create that for the creatures. The creatures come. I love them. I love when the birds come. It makes me really happy.
Right.
Like, so the plants, the birds, the insects, all of that makes me happier, more joyful, more caring than any kind of relationship to a kind of capitalist consumerism. So I think that we need to have those, but we always, because we're in capitalism so deeply, it's like you have to really consciously resist and turn away and say, where else can I get pleasure? How else can I feel joy and bliss and wonder and beauty and all of that in the world, and take care of other creatures? We're not supposed to think in that way, right? Like, because capitalism wants us to just think, well, you just got to buy lots of stuff. You got to spend lots of money, then you'll be happy. But there's a whole other set of values that you can embrace, but not just values, but practices, like actually doing the things. But it demands almost like you have to work against the brainwashing of the whole culture. So,
Right. Okay.
but then again, there's my beautiful garden. I love it. It makes me happy. And it also seems to make the birds, butterflies, bees, and other things happy.
Right. That's awesome. That was a great description of that. That's all the questions I had for you for today. Before I do end this interview, though, I do just want to say to anybody that's watching, if you have not had the opportunity to read her article, I highly recommend. It was very informative, very knowledgeable, and it definitely showed me an entirely new perspective that I had never thought of before. So I really enjoyed reading it. And I just want to thank you again so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really impressed that you took on this big challenge. So
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really glad that some of the things made sense to you. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thanks. Bye-bye.